Welcome to session 16 of our class on Biblical Worldview 1. We are still in chapter 6, and as far as the PowerPoint is concerned, we are on slide number 20. It's at this point that Saul makes his first mistake. In 1 Samuel 13, Saul grows impatient, waiting for Samuel to arrive in order to offer a sacrifice prior to battle. Saul disobediently chooses to offer the sacrifice himself. Now, his second mistake is in chapter 14. In the midst of a battle, Saul makes a foolish vow. Fulfilling this vow would have led to the death of his son Jonathan. The very idea of telling his troops not to eat anything until the battle is finished, until the victory is won, was extremely foolish because, you go for hours and hours without eating, especially in a situation where you're exerting yourself a great deal. This is simply a recipe for disaster. But on top of that, you have the vow, which simply put his people at risk, but also put his son at risk. Again, if they had taken the vow and completely went by it and fulfilled it, then Jonathan would have had to have died. Now in 1 Samuel 15, he makes his third mistake, and this is where he directly disobeys God's command to destroy the Amalekites. And for God, as our authors point out, this is the last straw. Excuse me. God told Saul to destroy everything and everyone, but yet he kept back all of the good stuff, the best of everything, and even spared the king of the Amalekites from death. So when we come to 1 Samuel 15, verse 26, Samuel says to Saul, "You have rejected the word of the Lord, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel." So it is from this point on in the reign of Saul, which is a total of 40 years, that God starts punishing Saul and is about to have Samuel anoint David. Now, let me check something real quick. Yeah. All right. This brings us to slide 24. As I said, David is anointed by Samuel at God's direction in 1 Samuel 16. And it's going to be several years before David comes to the throne. I don't know that we can nail it down as to exactly how many years, but it could be 10, 15, 20 years for all I know. But and we're not given a great deal of chronological data at the beginning of chapter 15, we're simply told that Samuel said to Saul, do these things. And and in the previous chapters, we simply do not have a great deal of data as to when exactly all this takes place in the reign of Saul. Now, there is one important statement at the end of chapter 14 that I want to call your attention to. And it says, "Now the war against the Philistines was severe all the days of Saul. And when Saul saw any mighty man or any valiant man, he attached him to his staff." The fact is that this is a statement that is going to it's going to, I guess you might say, foreshadow the choice of David to the staff of the administration, you might say, of Saul. And he is, the description of David in this situation is extremely important when we get to how David is described in all the passages. So again, what we need to be looking for then is the description that is found here in 1 Samuel 14:52, that so when Saul saw any mighty man, which this comes from the Hebrew word Gibor, which is used of several people throughout the scriptures, especially in the time of David, concerning mighty warriors. In fact, when we get to David's reign and his actually becoming king, he will have a list. I think it's near the end of 2 Samuel. There will be a list of David's mighty men, and this is the word that is used of them. And then the word valiant man is literally, let me get this here, son of strength, son of, let me get it looked up here to give you the exact it would be son of strength, son of efficiency. Speaking of physical power, is I think what's in view here in 1 Samuel 14:52. So this is the type of man that David is going to be described as. Now, when you also see in slide 24 the phrase stark contrast to Saul. It is God who says in chapter well, I guess we'll have to look it up. It's 1 Samuel chapter 13 and verse 14. When Samuel is speaking with Saul, he says, "But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." And so in this case, this is a somewhat of a prophecy that the Lord has already picked out someone who's going to replace you. And it is someone, again, who is a man after God's own heart. Now that, that particular statement is a very telling contrast between Saul and David. Saul is not a man after God's own heart. He is not a man who is penitent. He is not a man who is obedient. Not perfect, but obedient. Okay? And that is what God is looking for. He's not looking for perfection. He's looking for humility. He's looking for the person who is able to admit when they're wrong and is able to change themselves to either come to God in obedience initially, or to come back to God when they have sinned and they need to get back into the cleansing blood of Christ. So this would be for someone who has completely left God and needs to come back. So moving on, in 1 Samuel 16:7, when Samuel goes to the house of David or Jesse, the father of David, he again, when Samuel walks in, as we said earlier, he finds many of Jesse's sons already there, present, waiting on Samuel, because he has sent ahead and told Jesse that he's coming. In verse 6, it is, well, let's just go back up to verse 3. It says, "You shall invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I designate to you." So Samuel, this is 1 Samuel 16, verse 4. "So Samuel did what the Lord said, and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, 'Do you come in peace?' He said, 'In peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice.' He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they entered, he looked at Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him, for God does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. And then Shammah, and all the way to the 7 of his sons, the Lord has not chosen these. And then Samuel said to Jesse in verse 11, are these all the children? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, and behold, he is tending the sheep. Then Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here. So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ready, with beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel arose and went to Ramah. Now, verse 14 is where we were talking about the departure of the Spirit of the Lord from Saul. It says, now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him. Saul's servants then said to him, behold, now an evil spirit from God is terrorizing you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you. Let them seek a man who is a skillful player on the harp. And it shall come about when the evil spirit from God is on you, that he shall play the harp with his hand, and you will be well. Now, this is actually the introduction to David and how David became a part of Saul's staff. He is, in the next several verses, he is brought in to, I guess you could say, interview for the position of court musician. But look at what is said in verses 17 and following. So Saul said to his servants, provide for me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me. Then one of the young men said, behold, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is a skillful musician. Okay, so we've got now a good man that's being recommended who can play well. All right, he's a very skillful musician. But then look at how he is further described. Again, 1 Samuel 16 and verse 18. A mighty man of valor, a warrior, one prudent in speech, and a handsome man, and the Lord is with him. So going back to 1 Samuel 14 and verse 52, you remember that anytime Saul saw a valiant man, a son of power, literally, a son of strength, he attached him to his staff. He's also described as a warrior. He's also described as a good speaker, and he's handsome. And more importantly, the Lord is with him. So Saul sent messengers, verse 19, to Jesse and said, send me your son David, who is with the flock. Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread and a jug of wine and a young goat, and sent them to Saul by David his son. Then David came to Saul and attended him, and Saul loved him greatly. Now, if that was all that was said of David in this passage, then, that would be fine. He already fits the bill for being a musician. But when he comes to interview for the position of court musician, what else does it say about him? He said, then David came to Saul and attended him, and Saul loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. Now, I think obviously this is from what we see in other passages that this is one of the armor bearers of Saul. But the armor bearer of an individual, whether it be a king or a prince like Jonathan, who has an armor bearer in other accounts that include him, Jonathan, the son of Saul. An armor bearer is one who carries, some of the heavier stuff that the fighter, in this case Saul, or again in another case Jonathan, he carries maybe some of the heavier stuff, or maybe some extra things that are needed by the one he's carrying them for. But he also must be a very good warrior. He must be a great warrior, as David has already been described. Okay? And if you look at the accounts of armor bearers, you will find in the case of Jonathan, he and his armor bearer one time climb up to the top of a hill and meet some Philistines, just the two of them. And it says that Jonathan and his armor bearer fought. Like I said, just the two of them. And God gave them the victory. So, just being an armor bearer is not for, men who don't necessarily know how to fight, or weak, or whatever. The armor bearer had to be a warrior in his own right. He had to be very good at war and fighting. So, but it's almost a turn of events kind of thing here, with David coming to interview for court musician and ending up being very much a part of the army, especially attached to Saul himself as an armor bearer. And there is, to a great extent, a training aspect to this. When you come to the military, especially being assigned to the king, you need to constantly go through training and learning more and getting better, because we know from the background of David that he that will be given later about him. He went face to face with lions and bears when his father's sheep were being attacked and were in danger. He got right up close to the bear and held the bear under his chin by the hair that was there, and he grabs the bear close to him and kills him. You don't do that if you're just some weakling little child, as is portrayed in many children's books, and many, if you're familiar with a Vacation Bible School type of arrangement, there's one song that is sung in Vacation Bible School, or at least it was in my time, when it says, little boy David went down to a babbling brook. Little boy David, 5 little stones he took. He put one in his sling, and it went round and round, and the giant came tumbling down, or something to that effect. Well, the whole idea of little boy David is just plain wrong. Okay? You might read some terms that are used of him and others, saying something to the effect of young man. And I'm not doubting that David was not young comparatively to others, probably late teens, early 20s, okay, certainly younger than Saul, and maybe even, Jonathan to a certain extent. We don't know exactly how old Jonathan was, but he's an accomplished warrior, having been part of the army for a while before David comes along. So he's probably older than David. But the fact is that when that term is used in many translations, calling David a young man, it's only the context that tells you whether that phrase is speaking of the age of the individual, because the word that is translated young man is a word that has a whole lot more to it, and is not necessarily, again, in and of itself referring to age. Again, it's only the context that's going to tell you whether the person being talked about is a young person. But again, even in our passage here, okay, verse 18, 1 Samuel 16, verse 18, it says, "Then one of the young men said," this is the same word that is used of David on a number of occasions. And this man happens to be an advisor to the king. Again, when we talk about being young, what exactly does that mean? Is he younger than Saul? Is he in his 30s, as opposed to 50s or whatever? So again, my point is that the word young being used here is not a good translation, because the word itself means it has to do with other things, like special. One of the men who is what's the word I'm looking for here? Well, the terms escape me, but the idea is that when we're talking about these type of persons, we're talking about someone special, someone with capabilities. And in some cases, again, the context will determine, in some cases, it's even used of soldiers who are elite, what we would consider special forces in our militaries, okay, branches of our military. So, again, the word young in front of this word is simply unfortunate, and it's only going to be the context which tells you whether this is referring to a young person. In fact, the word is also used of Moses when he is a baby. And the word, let me just go ahead and find it. It's going to be in Exodus chapter 1 is where it should be, or Exodus chapter 2. Yeah, Exodus chapter 2. Well, I thought it was going to be used. I thought it was used of Moses. Maybe I'm. Yeah, I ever evidently I missed it. Um, it's in this Exodus chapter 2 and verse 6, where the word is used. Um, Exodus 2 6. It says, when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. Um, the the word that is used there for boy in the New American Standard is the word na'ar, which is the word that is translated young man or young men, one of the young men in 1 Samuel chapter 16, when the young man is recommending David to Saul. So it's used here of a child in Exodus chapter 2, and it is used of a man who is part of Saul's staff, and evidently a very capable man, because he again is an advisor to Saul. Um, and Sorry, I'm trying to make a note here where on this particular passage, so next time I am able to note which word it is. Okay. Sorry for the interruption. So, moving onward, let's look at slide 26. And the the slide says Saul underscores how smart, brave, and dedicated David is. This would be in, they don't, well, I guess they'll give the passage in the next. No, they don't give a passage for that. But let's get over here to the chapter and see if they give it in the textbook itself. Well, there's no passage given in the textbook either. So let's just move on and look at the next slide, slide 27. Civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul following Saul's death. Well, there's a whole lot that happens between the time that David is anointed to the time that Saul dies. Again, exactly how many years we're talking about, we don't exactly know. But excuse me, the fact is that, Saul or Samuel, defeats Goliath in 1 Samuel 17. And then this is when Saul becomes jealous of David and he basically chases him all over the country after trying to kill him 2 or 3 times while he's still in the palace. David then flees with the help of Jonathan. And there is one thing that I want to note before we move to Saul's death, and that is that in the chapter I don't know how we got back there. Again, you come to 1 Samuel 17. That's where you have the battle with Goliath, or the fight with Goliath, that David wins. But David killing Goliath at the last of the chapter. And at the beginning of chapter 18, it talks about how Jonathan and David are very close friends. They have such a close friendship. It says they love each other. But it's in 1 Samuel 18, starting in verse 10, that Saul turns against David and so forth. And if you go on down, you notice in verse 20 that David marries Saul's daughter. Saul tries to kill him, like I said, on a few occasions. He even sends him out to fight against the Philistines. Specifically, he he sends him out to fight against the Philistines, but he also sends him out at one point to kill some Philistines, and it says that Saul said to him in verse 25 of 1 Samuel 18, Saul then said, "Thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies." Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hands of the Philistines. Well, David takes this challenge and he goes out and he not only kills 100 Philistines, but he kills 200, and he brings back their foreskins and marries the daughter of Saul, who's named Michal. Well, you go on down into chapter 19, and you have Jonathan seeking to help David, to protect him, and Saul tries to kill him again. I'm looking for a passage, must be later on down the line. And Jonathan makes a covenant with David, and David with Jonathan in 1 Samuel 20. And you go on down. Saul tries to kill Jonathan in verse 33. And when he goes out to David, he they say farewell, but there's another passage that I can't find off the top of my head here that speaks of Jonathan saying to David, he says, he knows, just like everybody else does, even Saul, that David is going to be the next king. Just exactly how he found that out, I don't remember. But Jonathan knows that David's going to be the next king. Now, Jonathan is the one who is rightfully to be the next king as far as genealogy goes, and the house of Saul, because Jonathan, I believe, is Saul's firstborn. But the fact is that Jonathan recognizes David's going to be the next king, and he says to him, he says, "You shall be king, and I shall be next to you." So Jonathan is of such an attitude that he is willing to give up the kingship to David for because he knows that's God's will. And at one point, he gives him his sword and his belt and so forth. Now, what I'm trying to get to in describing all of this is there are several things that a person needed to be able to claim the kingship if, in fact, he was not the firstborn of the king or one of the descendants of the king himself. Number one, a person could become king if he has married into the family of the king. That is, the king can choose one of his son-in-laws to be king. Number two, you had to be anointed by a prophet of God. Number three, if you had the weapons and the belt of the firstborn to show that you have this part of the need, the things that are needed to become king. And there's a couple of others that I can't remember off the top of my head, but the idea is that David is, number one, the son-in-law of the king. He has married Michal. He has been anointed by a prophet of God, and he has the weapons of the firstborn when Jonathan gives them to him. So the idea is that Jonathan says, I'm going to be with you. I know you're going to be king, and I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to be, a part of the administration instead of being king myself. So this took a lot of courage and humility on the part of Jonathan to say those things and to mean them. So we go on, and sadly, Saul begins to, after David has left, Saul begins to chase David all over the country, all over the land of Israel. And I guess David mostly stays in the south, but when I say all over the land, I don't mean, literally from north to south, but all over the territory of the south around, Judah and the Negev, which is the south part of the country. But you have finally a battle with the Philistines where Saul is killed and Jonathan is also. But before this happens, Saul is seeking God's blessing, God's advice on this battle. He doesn't want to go into the battle without God on his side, but he also knows that God has told him that he's done with him. So he does. He commits sin by going to a medium, as it is put. Let's just get down to 1 Samuel 31 is where Saul is killed, but it's up in chapter 28 where Saul consults the medium. This is a person who believes they can summon the dead from the grave. They can talk to the dead. Just a little side note here. Notice in verse 11, it says, "Then the woman said," this is 1 Samuel 28, verse 11, "The woman said, 'Whom shall I bring up for you?' And he said, 'Bring up Samuel for me.' And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice." I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is, who's the one that is most surprised of Samuel actually coming up from the dead? His spirit, that is. She is. Saul expects her to do what he thinks she can do, but she is the one who is surprised. So I believe that what we're looking at here is a person who is a fake. She cannot really bring up the dead, and she has fooled people into thinking that she can. And I don't believe that there was anybody who could bring up anyone from the dead, or any magicians that could perform any kind of magic back then. The only one who can bring people back from the dead is God or Christ or one of their obedient followers, such as the prophets and the apostles and so forth. But I believe just from this one passage that this woman is a fake, just like all other mediums and magicians are. Now, if you want to discuss that further, feel free to email me or call me, and I'll be glad to give you many more passages and many more reasons as to why I believe this to be the case. But after Saul dies, we come to this third point there on slide number 27. After Saul dies, there is civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul. The person who is left from the house of Saul, who becomes king in his place in the northern, or in the 10 tribes of Israel. let's see, is Ishbosheth. Okay. This is 2 Samuel chapter 2, beginning with verse 8. And Abner is the commander of the armies of Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, who has been made king. And he reigns for 2 years. It says in verse 10, he reigns as king over Israel for 2 years. But it says in verse 10, the house of Judah, however, followed David. The time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. Well, there's civil war. There's fighting between the house of Ishbosheth and the house of David. And the house of David gains strength, and then Ishbosheth offends Abner, and Abner joins with David. Ishbosheth is killed, but David does not approve of that. Joab murders Abner, but David does not approve of that. It's done without his knowledge. And this simply is the beginning in 2 Samuel 5 of David being king over all Israel. Okay? There is a chronological note in 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 4 that I had forgotten about, and it does help us maybe a little bit with at what point in Saul's reign that David is anointed. And that is in verse 4 of 2 Samuel 5. It says, David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. Well, if he's 30 years old when he becomes king, and he is he's a mighty warrior, a mighty valiant man, a warrior, a man that's good in speech, and the Lord is with him, and so forth and so on, then you're going to have to put David at that time when he becomes part of Saul's staff, at least at 18. 16 would be a little bit, I think, too young in that case, but 18 to 20 maybe. So you're looking at 10 to 12 years from the time that David comes on the scene to the time that he becomes king. And again, that's just a guess, but I think it's a pretty educated guess considering what we know about the facts here as given in 2 Samuel 5. Okay, so we come to 2 Samuel 5 and verse 5, where it says, at Hebron he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and in Jerusalem he reigned 33 years over all Israel and Judah. But it's prior to this that in verse 1 of chapter 5 that is quoted, starting to be quoted in slide 28 of the PowerPoint. It says, all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, we are your own flesh and blood. In the past, while Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel on their military campaigns. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will become their ruler. What's interesting here is, as I said earlier, when Saul was made king over Israel, that God did not intend to give up his position as king over Israel. And therefore, the person who was to be the ruler on earth, was called a prince. The word in Hebrew for king is melech. Transliterated into English, that would be M-E-L-E-K. But the word for prince is Nagid, N-A-G-I-D. And that happens to be the word that is used by the people of the other 10 tribes when they say, the Lord said to you. And this would be a quote from 2 Samuel 7 and verse, well, that wouldn't make sense. Let me check something here. This would be 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 30, where the word is used of David by Abigail, actually. Let's see if there's another reference. This actually goes all the way back to 1 Samuel 13, where Saul is told that his kingdom will not endure. He said, the Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart. The Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded. The word ruler there is the term for prince or ruler, as it's translated. But the idea is that, again, God never intended to give up his place as king, and he only intended for the man who would be on the throne in Israel to be a prince, that is, an underling below God, and the king or the ruler was supposed to recognize that God was actually the one in charge. So we again see that that is the case. Then in slide 29, they finish verses 1 through 4, where it says, when all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed king over Israel. Again, David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned for 40 years. So David is 70 when he dies at the end of, actually at the beginning of 1 Kings. The next slide, slide 30, deals with the victories of David. After he becomes king, he first conquers Jerusalem in 2 Samuel 5. He also defeats the Philistines in 2 Samuel 5. And in defeating the Philistines, he brings well, no, it's not because he defeats the Philistines, but after defeating the Philistines, he brings the Ark of the Covenant back from its resting place in the house of Abinadab in 2 Samuel 6 and verse 4. So they brought it with the ark of God from the house of Abinadab. Okay. This is, again, if you go back and you study the account of the ark back in the early days of Samuel, in or actually the last days of Eli, in the early days of Samuel, the ark was taken into battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines had all kinds of problems with it. They were struck with all kinds of diseases and so forth. And they sent the ark back to Jerusalem, and it landed up in the house of Abinadab after going at least one other place. So, so David brings the ark to Jerusalem. In slide 31, we talk about the Davidic covenant. You know, when we discuss the covenant with Abraham back in Genesis chapters 12 and 15, we made the statement that the Davidic covenant would be given in 2 Samuel chapter 7, and that's where it is. And we said that, you know, the Mosaic covenant was temporary, okay, and was done away with at the cross of Christ. And there are many passages that speak to that. Romans chapter 7, verses 1 through 7 is a very clear passage. The book of Galatians is very clear that the Mosaic law has been done away with all of its parts, including the Ten Commandments. But at the time when we talked about the covenants, the covenant with Abraham, the covenant with Moses, and the covenant with David, we made the statements that the covenant with Abraham carried through past the covenant with Moses and the Israelites, in that the seed promise given to Abraham, through your seed all nations of the earth will be blessed. That seed promise was fulfilled in Jesus, but it was also fulfilled in the fact that the Gentiles came into the church. This is pointed out very clearly in the book of Galatians. And the covenant with David also goes beyond the death of Jesus, and therefore beyond the Mosaic covenant, in that it too is fulfilled in Jesus. So God promises, the slide here, slide 31, says God promises that a descendant of David will be established on the throne of a kingdom that will last forever. And Jesus is the fulfillment of this promise. And that is very true, that Jesus is now reigning on the throne of David for eternity. And therefore the kingdom that is promised here in 2 Samuel 7 is not a physical kingdom. It does not consist of Jesus coming back to this earth to reign in Jerusalem on the throne of David for 1,000 years and so forth. And there are many passages that speak to the fact that the kingdom that is being spoken of here is a spiritual kingdom. Let's just take you to one particular passage real quick that speaks to this. I believe it's going to be Jeremiah 21. In Jeremiah 21, sorry, it's Jeremiah 22. The king Jehoiachin is the one that is taken off into captivity, into Babylonian captivity, at the end of well, it's prophesied in Jeremiah 22, starting in verse 24. He's going to be taken off into captivity to Babylon. And what I'm trying to get to is that in Jeremiah 22, starting in verse 28, it says, "Is this man Coniah," that is just another name for Jehoiachin, "is this man Coniah a despised shattered jar, or is he an undesirable vessel? Why have he and his descendants been hurled out and cast into a land that they had not known? O land, 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 hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord," verse 30, "write this man down childless. A man will not prosper in his days, for no one of his descendants will prosper sitting on the throne of David or ruling again in Judah." Notice that this prophecy concerns the line of Jehoiachin, okay? And it concerns sitting on the throne of David or ruling again in Judah, that is, on earth, in the region of Judah, the area of the tribe of Judah, which includes Jerusalem. So no man of this man's descendants, no one of his descendants is going to reign again in Jerusalem. And if you go to Matthew chapter 1, I believe it is Matthew chapter 1 and verse 12, where Jehoiachin is an ancestor of Christ. So therefore, Christ cannot rule on the throne of David in Jerusalem on earth. He therefore is reigning in heaven now, and the kingdom of David is now a spiritual kingdom over which the Son of David is ruling, and that is Jesus Christ. Now, one of the other reasons that we are told that David's covenant, the covenant with David, goes beyond the cross, is that in Acts chapter 13, I think verses 34 and 35, it speaks of the resurrection of Jesus and how this was a fulfillment of the covenant with David. And then in Acts chapter 15, beginning with verse 13, says, after they had stopped speaking, you got to understand Acts 15 is what's called the circumcision conference. And it is where the discussion is going on concerning whether Gentiles have to become Jews before they can become Christians. That is, Gentiles have to be circumcised before they can be baptized. That's the discussion that is going on here. And Peter has given his evidence, and Paul and Barnabas have given their evidence of how God worked to prove to them that the Gentiles are now to be accepted into the church by their obedience to the gospel and not by their obedience to the law of Moses. Okay? It says, after they had stopped speaking, this is Acts 15:13, James answered, saying, Brethren, listen to me. Simeon has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. With this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written, after these things I will return, and I will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which has fallen, and I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it, so that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from long ago. Now first, this is a quotation from Amos chapter 9, verses 9 through 11, I believe. And verses 11 and 12 is what this is. Amos 9, verses 11 and 12. And again, it speaks of rebuilding the tabernacle of David, which has fallen. Now, if you go back again to the Babylonian captivity, the beginning of it, Jehoiachin is taken off into captivity, and Zedekiah, his son, is placed on the throne in his place. This is a few years before the final destruction of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar in 586, 587. So he's taken off into captivity. Zedekiah, his son, is put on the throne. Zedekiah is then killed by a faction of people who are anti-Babylonian, and therefore, the Babylonians are the ones who put Zedekiah on the throne, and that's why he's assassinated, because he was put there by the Babylonians, and he was saying, we must give in to the Babylonians, we must give over to them and obey them if we're going to be in line with God's will. And that's exactly what Jeremiah had been preaching. Okay? But the point here is that the tabernacle of David, some translations say the tent of David, it refers to the house of David, the dynasty of David. The tabernacle or tent or house or dynasty of David has fallen. And again, with Zedekiah being killed, there is no son of David on the throne at all for the rest of history. Now, when I say on the throne, I mean on the throne in Jerusalem, because of what was prophesied by Jeremiah. Let me just stop here and make a statement here that I think is very pertinent. Those who say that Jesus is going to come back and he's going to set up a physical kingdom in Jerusalem and reign on the throne of David for 1,000 years and gather up an army and drive out all the foreigners from Israel, and Israel will then have the land to themselves as God had promised. We've already talked about the fact that the land promise was fulfilled back at the end of Joshua. But for those who say that this all is going to happen sometime in the future, that Jesus is going to reign on earth, they basically call Jeremiah a false prophet. And therefore, they're wrong. So, the tabernacle of David has fallen. There's no king on the throne from David's descendants. But this passage says that the tabernacle of David, the dynasty of David, would be rebuilt. It would be restored. And again, the fact is that it was restored in Jesus, in a spiritual kingdom that is administered from heaven itself. And that spiritual kingdom is the church. But this was done, according to James, as he quotes from Amos 9, this was done so that, verse 17 of Acts 15, so that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord and all the Gentiles who are called by my name. So the fulfillment of the covenant of David goes all the way down the years into the first years of the church, and is finally completely fulfilled in the Gentiles coming into the church. So the covenant of Abraham and the covenant of David lasted longer than the covenant with Moses and the people of Israel. And that is an extremely important point in all of these discussions. Okay, we'll stop here and pick up with slide 32 and get into the actual covenant that is made with David when we come back in session number 17. As always, if you need any help, please let me know.